Many homosexuals either are or want to be parents. In general, though, society views this idea with disapproval. Homosexuality and parenthood seem to many incompatible. They believe that gay parents will somehow corrupt their children. But new research, which we'll be looking at tonight, suggests that this may be ill-founded. Such research is, however, very recent, and public opposition remains strong. One of the most important reflections of this is the attitude of the courts towards gay parents. For lesbian mothers in particular, this can create real suffering. Marian Ayres is a mother of two who married not knowing that she was gay.
My marriage was okay as far as my ex-husband was concerned. I didn't realise that I was gay until after I'd got married and had my two children. Then I began to realise that the attraction towards other women was much more than my attraction to my ex-husband.
9 years after marrying, she met Renee Sawyer.
And then we started seeing each other fairly regularly, you know, at least once a week.
Yeah.
And then the relationship got really, you know, was getting stronger and stronger. And then we decided that we both wanted to live with one another, you know.
That's when you said that you'd tell your husband?
That's when I told Dale that I was gay. And he was shocked at first. I don't think he quite realised what I was talking about. I don't think he quite understood.
She decided to leave her husband and, for the time being, left her children with him.
I was frightened of bringing them away from their home. You know, even I was frightened into what I was going into. At least that they were safe and secure at home, you know, with their dad, with their own family and in their school. They wasn't coming into meeting strangers and that, the same as what I was.
Her husband refused to allow the children to see her lover.
All through my life, I felt I was quite an ordinary, normal person, and I was suddenly made to feel abnormal. That there was something within me that somebody else saw as a danger towards two small little girls. I was quite shocked and horrified that anyone could take this attitude.
Later, Marian Ayres' husband divorced her. She wanted unrestricted access to her children, so the court sent a welfare officer to make inquiries.
He wanted to know the living surroundings, what we was living in, what the place was like, our sleeping arrangements. Oh, that's with the access, wasn't it?
No, the welfare officer did want to know the sleeping arrangements, and they seemed to make a great big point about the sleeping arrangements here, where the children would sleep if they were able to stay the night. And we explained, you know, what arrangements we had made so that the children would be comfortable and safe and secure.
Although they got unrestricted access, they don't think they'd ever get custody.
Well, I don't think it would stand really unearthly. I've been surprised in the last 2 years what we've had to go through. I never realised that, that there's been so much prejudice. Prejudice in so much as things that we've had to go through that a heterosexual relationship or marriage would never have had to go through, given the same kind of circumstances. And to get actual custody of the children, one would have to prove that the father was untrustworthy, that he was beating the children, anything like that. We wouldn't have a chance whatsoever because we are gay and because we've gone through court once.
Not having custody of her children causes Marian much distress.
Well, I miss them, obviously, you know. Every time I take them home, I wish that I never had to. I get really terribly upset when they say, "Mum, I don't want to go home." Stop.
Marian Ayres' case isn't an isolated one. Many lesbian mothers fear the court's attitudes and accept that they will simply lose custody of their children, with all the distress that involves. And their fears are well-founded. Sadie Robarts is a London barrister who has a lot of experience of custody cases.
Well, I think lesbian custody cases didn't even become an issue in the family courts until the early 1970s. And after that, until 1976, I don't think any mother who admitted that she was a lesbian was given custody of her children. Then in the autumn of 1976, the Court of Appeal awarded a mother custody of 3 of her children. She'd looked after all of them for all their lives. Since then, there have been few cases coming before the courts, and I think that in perhaps half a dozen of them, the mother has gained custody of the children, but that may not be in what we call a straight fight. It may well have been that the husband has agreed to the mother having custody and that he's had generous access to the children.
So the court's attitudes until 1976 were clearly against lesbian mothers and still remain ambiguous. In general, it's fair to say that where it's a straight choice between a heterosexual and a homosexual home, the courts always prefer the heterosexual. A recent judgment in a custody case involving a lesbian mother shows this clearly.
It would be less harmful to the child if he were to have a sound upbringing with his father. I am not saying that no lesbian mother should ever have custody, but if there is a better alternative home available, the child's best interests would seem to indicate that he should be there.
The reasons for this attitude were explained in a House of Lords judgment in 1976.
Changes in public attitudes should not entitle the courts to relax, in any degree, the vigilance and severity with which they should regard the risk of children, at critical ages, being exposed or introduced to ways of life which may lead to severance from normal society, to psychological stresses and unhappiness, and possibly even to physical experience, which may scar them for life.
The main object of deciding custody is to try to see that the child is as little affected by the breakup of its parents' marriage as possible, and that it leads as normal a life as possible. And therefore, the first factor in which homosexuality would be relevant is that a homosexual relationship is not normal in the sense that it is unusual. In this country, the normal family is based on a heterosexual relationship. And indeed, if there hadn't been a heterosexual relationship somewhere along the line, there wouldn't have been a child. So that's the first factor. The second factor is that the court, where a parent has entered into a new relationship, is looking for stability. And one of the tests of stability of a heterosexual relationship is whether the parties to it have married each other. Now, that isn't an available test of the stability of a homosexual relationship. The next factor, I think, that is relevant is this question of the values of the child itself. It is living in an abnormal or unusual situation, and therefore there is a danger to the child that its values may become mixed up and disturbed or other than the norm, and indeed that the child itself might be brought up to have homosexual tendencies.
Well, I think they, in some cases, are worried about the children coming into contact with the mother's lifestyle and with her lovers, and if a lot of her friends are lesbians. There is what I think of as a very unreasonable fear that if they're male children, they're in some way going to be emasculated by contact with a lot of women, and they're going to grow up to be homosexuals themselves. And of course, with female children, they will be in some way indoctrinated into becoming lesbians. There is, of course, no research to actually support this, but it's certainly a supposition very strongly held by both courts and by husbands claiming custody of the children, and indeed perhaps by the experts brought by the husbands.
Sometimes a lesbian mother can accidentally get custody. Sue got custody of her daughter when she and her husband divorced 8 years ago. At that time, she didn't realize she was gay.
When my marriage broke up, it was a very mutual breakup, in the sense that neither of us particularly wanted to live together anymore. Lesbianism certainly wasn't an issue at the time, and I had no idea whatsoever that I was a lesbian.
Oh, is it? About all the schools.
What, the senior schools?
The hard things, you know.
4 years later, she came to realise that she was gay and is now living with another woman. Together, they're bringing up her 9-year-old daughter. She doesn't accept the argument that children of gay parents are necessarily cut off from normal society.
They're in a heterosexual environment. There is no way that you can actually isolate your child from that environment. Probably the only way would be to actually live completely separately, and that would mean living in the country, for example, not with your child not attending school or going to the shops or whatever. But basically, your child is coming into contact with heterosexuals, not only people, but in books, on the television, wherever that child happens to be. The outside world is heterosexual. And so I don't think there's any way at all that a child can be brought up in a totally gay environment. I don't think that my being a lesbian is actually going to affect Mandy very much. Maybe in terms of practical day-to-day things from time to time, it may do. But overall, Mandy's actually growing up to be very much a little girl, in the straight sense, the heterosexual sense of the word. I don't think that it's going to affect her. But one thing I do think is important is that she actually has a choice and can see the alternatives to being heterosexual. I think that maybe in some ways I would hope that she doesn't grow up to be gay, because the problems are quite enormous. But then I would like her, nevertheless, to see the alternatives and to see that there are alternatives, because most children don't actually have that opportunity and are brought up very much in a closed setup where there aren't any alternatives.
Lesbian mothers like Sue may believe that arguments against lesbians bringing up children are ill-founded, but this won't remove public disquiet. And as long as that remains, the courts will feel bound to take a cautious attitude. Until now, there's been little evidence to show whether these fears are correct. However, a study has just been completed at the University of London which looked at some of these questions.
Well, we studied 27 lesbian mothers and their children. There were 37 children in all. And we compared the mothers and the children with a control group of 27 heterosexual single-parent mothers and their children, and there were 38 children in that group. What we did was to interview the mothers and the children about the family situation, about the work pattern of the mother, past and present relationships of the mother. And we also interviewed the mothers about the children's social activities and friends and psychiatric state. The children's interview concerned the children's friendships and, again, psychiatric state and favourite activities, toys, and that kind of thing. We compared two groups. The main variables that we were looking at were psychosexual development, that is, looking at sex roles in the children and gender identity, and psychiatric state of the children.
The study took 3 years to complete, and they've now analysed the results.
Well, basically, we found no differences between the two groups in the social and emotional development of the children. That is, that friendships followed fairly similar patterns in both groups. There was no difference in the instance of psychiatric disorder, and the instance of disorder was no higher than was found generally. And also, with respect to sex role development, there were no differences between groups.
Sexual and emotional development are obviously complex questions. This recent research needs to be applied with care, and much more work needs to be done. It does, however, suggest that some of the assumptions about homosexuals as parents will have to be re-examined. The findings apply only to lesbian mothers, but some gay men either are or want to be parents too. 9 years ago, Graham Chapman and his lover, David Sherlock, became unofficial parents to a teenage runaway they'd been asked to look after.
We found out where his father lived and got in touch with him and discovered that, in fact, John was 14 years old and been missing from home for about 6 months or so. Had a long chat with his father, got on rather well with him, and between us we decided really that John would probably, if he went back to live in Huyton near Liverpool, would probably just run away to London again, and that he might as well at least stay at my place where I had plenty of room, and then at least might also go back to school, and which of course he wasn't doing at the time. He hadn't been to school for some time. And John seemed to think that he would go to school if he was allowed to stay in London, and that's how it all began, really. So it was a mutual agreement between John's father and myself.
Both John and his father realised that Chapman was living with another man.
He wasn't worried about that at all, actually. No problem.
John has found other people's reactions generally sympathetic.
And at that time, I didn't have many of my own friends in London. I've since made friends. And they seem to, well, they've been marvellous, really. I haven't had any problems with them. They all know that Graham's gay, and, well, they're around here all the time, all my friends, and it doesn't bother them in the slightest.
Chapman thinks those who oppose gays as parents don't really understand.
Well, they've no idea what gay men are. Gay men are just men. And most people, whether they know it or not, have a little bit of gayness in them somewhere. If they take the trouble to read the Kinsey report or almost medical information would point to the fact that there is a little bit of homosexuality in everyone. And Kinsey goes on a scale from 0 to 6, where 0 is completely heterosexual and 6 is completely homosexual. The two extremes are, in fact, rather rare. I rated about 4 myself, actually. I have to confess to occasional heterosexual activity, which sometimes annoys David. But that's the truth. I mean, I don't quite understand why. I don't like being categorized myself as being purely homosexual, for instance.
We asked Graham Chapman if he would like to have adopted John.
Yes, although in actual practice it hasn't made much difference, in that, I mean, to all intents and purposes, I have been his guardian, his father. Now, of course, he's 23 years old, and no longer really his guardian, although in actual fact it's surprising you never stop being a parent.
If a gay man does want to adopt, the chances of doing so are remote, and so very few apply.
In my experience, we have not had homosexual parents applying to adopt a child. We have had a homosexual pair fostering a child who was related to them. I do know of other agencies who have placed children with homosexual parents. I think it is still very rare, and I think it would be true to say that agencies would vary in their attitude to this and whether they would accept applications.
Margaret Bowyer's own attitude would be one of caution.
We have to strike a very fine balance between taking enough risks to dare to place children with families at all and not taking unnecessary risks that are going to place children in situations that might harm or confuse them. I think we have to weigh up each case on its own merits. I think that we must continue to be cautious. I would not like to see the door closed completely to applicants, because the homosexual element is only one factor of many. But I do think that it is important always to be very cautious with these applications for our children's sakes.
No, typical.
In other countries, adoption procedures aren't as rigorous, especially in third world countries, where orphaned or unwanted children have bleak prospects. Nicholas Stoodley is an English businessman who lives in the Philippines. He and his 24-year-old Filipino lover, Alan de Lochol, have begun the process of adopting de Lochol's illegitimate nephew.
I used to go down to his place in the south, a province, and he had a little nephew down there that was the result of a little bit of Saturday night fever, and had subsequently been sort of dropped by the mother because she married somebody else. And I was just sitting down one day, and this little Mowgli-like character from the Jungle Book walked in. who impressed me as being somebody that had an awful lot of potential and an awful lot going for somebody that had really been, you know, not doing anything at all with his life. He'd just been left alone. And that's how I got to meet Bong.
With his mother's consent, 10-year-old Bong went to live in Manila, and Stoodley has now started moves to adopt him.
He's been up in Manila, where I live now, for about just over a year. I haven't adopted him before because I basically wanted, and I explained it to him, that I wanted him to make the decision. I wanted that very much because by the time he gets to the age of 15 or 16, where he might start thinking more seriously about what's happened, I want him to be able to say to himself, well, I made the decision myself. He's now made that decision and he wants me to adopt him, and so I'm going ahead and doing it right now. It's not a particularly difficult process.
Stoodley doesn't accept the idea that gay parents will corrupt their children.
He has as much risk physically from being assaulted by me when he grows up to the age of 16, I suppose, as a daughter would have from being assaulted by her father. I don't think that's a problem at all. I'm bringing him up with a very healthy attitude. I mean, he already has girlfriends. If he came to me at the age of 15 and said, I just met a very nice boy, I'd probably investigate and find out whether he was a nice boy, and if he was, I'd say, okay, fine. But I wouldn't automatically say to him, well, that therefore makes you gay and you can't have girlfriends. If he subsequently goes out and have girlfriends, that's fine as well. It's basically up to him to be able to find out his own level.
I see, yeah.
You still don't have it, you see?
Another objection to gay men adopting is that the child would not have a mother figure.
Well, there, of course, I can't do anything to help because we are basically two men living together and there is not a mother. Alan is not a surrogate mother, and I would hate that sort of relationship anyway. I just try to give him the best balanced upbringing I can, and taking into account that there is, in fact, not a mother around. You know, there are a lot of women around that presumably he can get some form of guidance from, that maybe I couldn't give him. But I agree that that's one thing I can't give him. But, you know, how many upbringings are ideal?
In England, single people can adopt only in special circumstances, which the adoption agencies decide. As we've seen, they're very cautious if homosexuals apply.
I think the law should be such that if the couple, if two men are in a good position to bring up a child responsibly and to be able to give that child love where it didn't have it before, then there should be the possibility to be able to do that. I don't think that suddenly there should be a change in the law and say, okay, now all homosexual couples can now adopt children, which is ridiculous because just as in a heterosexual marriage, in a homosexual marriage there are unsuitable parents. It's a question of, you know, a case-to-case basis. You can't generalize.
Gay parents, men and women, clearly feel that public attitudes towards them are somewhat unreasonable. And the research we've looked at suggests that many assumptions about gay parents may need to be re-examined. But the courts and the adoption agencies have in their custody the future lives of children, many of whom are already disadvantaged. Until such time as more research is available and public attitudes have changed, we can hardly be surprised if they opt for caution, despite the distress this may cause to gay parents.